let's talk photography a little bit. So, tell me a bit about it. It sounds like quite a tailwind at the start, no?
You know,
I mean, I know it was hard. I know you were living in your car, borrowing money for like gas to go to the right spots. Like, what was the drive? How did you?
you know, I think that there's something to be said for when you don't really have many other options, when you don't really have a plan B. And for me, photography was that. And it wasn't about photography. I could care, to be honest, I don't want to bum anybody out, but I don't care that much about the camera or the act of taking pictures. It was always about traveling. You know, when you grow up without a passport and you grow up not seeing the world at all, you don't know anything that's out there outside of your small town. To me, that was the goal. I wanted to see what was out there. I wanted to see the world. And I felt like photography, the camera, could be the tool to get me there. And that was what it's always been, and that's what it's always been about, and that's always been the driving force. So in the beginning, you know, you asked, you know, what was motivating you? Like, college wasn't an option. I didn't have the money or the means to do that, and I also knew that I wasn't going to learn what I wanted to learn. So I quit my job at 19. I quit school, and I was like, I'm going to give photography everything. And if I'm thriving, great, but I also knew that I was young. And while most of my friends were at college, you know, dicking around or whatever, I was just like head down, focusing on shooting. And it wasn't glamorous at all. It was pretty brutal, like living in the back of a, you know, it wasn't van life. It wasn't like a $200,000 Sprinter van. It was like living in the back of a small Toyota Tacoma in beach parking lots, waking up trying to like be there, you know, at the right time, sunrise. And so I guess, you know, to like look back at it, really, it was that driving force of, and it still is, of just wanting to see and experience new places. And I felt like I knew I had to put in my time and my effort, but I feel like now I get to fully embody that. And it's not always about using the camera. Sometimes it's about riding a bike. Riding a bike is an amazing tool to see new landscapes. If I'm on skis or on my own 2 feet or on a bike or using a camera, or if I'm maybe the subject or I'm telling a story about a subject, directing. I love the idea of storytelling, and that's kind of what it comes down to.
I can't wait to bring you back here. I know you've heard me say it so many times, but this might be the most beautiful place I've ever been. The rare, often fleeting glimpses of what our planet has to offer are a privilege to witness. And sharing these elusive moments is one of my greatest callings. That allure has brought me to Alaska, to Wrangell St. Elias, the largest national park inside the largest state in the US. Airplanes are really the only way to see so much of this great land. The best roads up here really are in the sky.
I grew up with a single parent, my mom. My dad wasn't around. And so when I turned like 8 or 9 years old, I was just hanging out with kids at school, this Tongan family that I really loved. And I saw their kind of family unit, and I really craved that. And, you know, because I didn't grow up with that. I didn't grow up with like brothers or sisters or a strong, you know, father figure or anything like that. So when I experienced that, I was like, this is what I want. And I would spend, you know, Friday night, Saturday night, and on Sundays, they're like, let's go, we're gonna go to church. Do you wanna go? And I was like, yeah, let's go. And so I started to go, and it, you know, that search for spirituality became really important to me, and it still is really important to me. And these days, I feel less and less like I identify with like a specific religion or church, but definitely everything I do in life is in some way related to a search for spiritual growth or understanding. But I will say one of the tricky things is, you know, growing up in this kind of blue collar environment and this blue collar home, and then all of a sudden, you know, for me, the idea of like saying no to work was like ingrained in me as like sacrilegious. You don't do that. You know, when opportunities come your way, you take everything, especially when you grow up without a lot. And so that was a tough thing to overcome, is what I'm saying. Like, it's challenging as you get older, because you start to develop these patterns. You want to provide for your family. You want to be a good, father, husband, whatever. And you develop this relationship with work where all of a sudden you're really good at something. You're really good at work. And sometimes you're better at work than you are maybe being a dad or being a good husband or being a friend. And again, I know I'm taking this to kind of a dark place, but the truth of the matter is like, that's what happens. I think that in America, where I'm from, this kind of hustle culture is very much ingrained in you, and I'm all for that. Like, I know how to hustle, but there's never a point where anybody stops you and says, "Hey, like you seem like you found some success. Have you ever thought to just stop and enjoy it?" And it almost makes me like emotional thinking about it, because like those are lessons that I had to learn from traveling. Those are lessons I learned from like coming to places like this, and also being on my bike, where I was able to see people who like, they could have achieved greater success in their life. But what's the point of that? It's just to stroke your ego. Like, isn't the point to figure out what you love doing and then do that all the time? And what I love doing is not working. I love telling stories. It doesn't always mean you need to get paid for it. So ultimately, it was a long road to realize that saying no is actually saying yes to what you want in your life, or prioritizing what you want. Because, I always thought that what I wanted was to be successful. And I realized that comes at a cost, a big cost to your family and your friends and yourself.
This is mental, dude. Are you kidding me? There's some volcanic acid rises.
I heard somewhere that you were very inspired by people like James Natchway and Salgado and do you have like big influences or inspirations in photography that maybe would help defining your style to yourself? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I love, you're such a legend. I love that you did your research, because that means a lot to me. I usually feel like I get on these like podcasts and I have to like tell my life story that I've done many times. But yeah, I was very inspired by James Notway. And for those who don't know, he was and he is kind of like the modern day, legend of, war and social issues of photography. And he's been in the war zone and a ton over the last 40 years. And he made an incredible film called War Photographer. And I remember seeing that when I was like 22, 23. And I was like, oh my God, like, I want to make a difference like that. Like, I want to shoot something that means something. And I was working as a surf photographer, and that was so cool, but I just felt like my images were only there to sell, to help the advertisers sell what they were selling, right? Because that's kind of how magazines work. They're driven by advertising. And I remember watching his film and just feeling like I wanted to try something new. And I remember planning a few trips that were going to take me to places that were a little like, these weren't like full war zones, but I was planning trips to places where I could work on more photojournalism. I was going to Cuba, I was going to India, I was going to more remote places. And I remember going to Nicaragua and shooting this area that was known as like one of the, I don't know, basically like the shittiest place you could be on earth. It's a trash dump called La Chureca, where people had lived. There was like 1,500 people living there, and kids were being prostituted, and families were like living in this really, really dire situation. And there were organizations going in there trying to help people and support them. And I had a friend of mine who was part of one of those organizations, and I went and helped document to utilize the images to basically help get funding to pull these people out. And I went there and I did shoot photos, and it was so emotionally challenging, because you're sitting there as a photographer thinking that you have this camera, you're coming from your Western experience, and you're just like, you don't even know how to process what you're seeing. It takes a level of like disassociation to kind of and to be able to be there. And James Notway talks about that in his film. Like he has to dissociate so he can work and then know that the work he's doing is going to help. And I guess I just felt like I was shooting the photos, I was in the moment, but I didn't feel like what I was creating was going to actually help anybody. And it was kind of a challenging time in my life where I was looking for more purpose, but I realized that wasn't something that I could fully handle. Like that wasn't something that I was going to be able to do. Like I left the workplace, or I left the battlefield, or whatever, you feeling and holding so much emotion that it was just really hard for me. And you know, maybe a better man or a better woman could do a better job. I just knew that after trying and attempting to kind of put myself in those positions, I just felt so ill-equipped to do the job that needed to be done, to kind of, because it's once you leave that place, once you leave with those images, that's when the real work starts. You have to think about, how are you pushing this out? How are you promoting it? How are you talking about it? You know, who are you sharing it with? And I didn't fully, you know, understand that. And it took me a while to realize that, like, what I really appreciated was being in nature, sharing the beauty of nature with people, and in the hopes that they can find that healing and that kind of respite that I found. And maybe social justice issues and war photography wasn't a calling for me.
You've been working both like with an incredible list of clients, and by that I don't mean like in terms of like prestige only, but like brands such as Patagonia, publications such as National Geographic, or Apple. Or has there been like collaborations that were hard for you, where you struggled, and how do you cope with compromise and that kind of things?
You know, I think that in the beginning of my career, there were moments where I felt like I was compromising something. It wasn't so much that I was compromising like my values or my moral compass or whatever, but it was more about the fact that I knew that I was traveling to places for my editors or for the people who I knew were paying the bills, you know, magazines at the time, going to places that were consistent and they were easy. Places that were easy. And my job was to sell this kind of sense of adventure. And that's not what I was doing. I was like fabricating that. You know, I'd go on these surf trips to places where there was a high-rise hotel behind me and strong Wi-Fi and good food. And I just didn't feel like I was capturing what I wanted to capture, which was like the adventure of it. And that's really what spurred my desire to seek out remote places like the Faroes and Norway and Iceland and Alaska and Kamchatka and Russia and everything. So I know that, you know, at times it felt like I was just doing myself a disservice. I was doing my creativity a disservice. And I found so much more joy and passion when I started to go to places and work on projects that felt like I was having to work harder for the images. And it's not because I'm a masochist, trust me. It's because you feel more connected to the work when you have to plan and prep, and there's more on the line, there's a little more risk. I think that when I turned that curve, when I sort of like made that decision 5 years into my career, I feel like all the projects I've done since then, I've been a big advocate for like promoting the work that you want to bring back. And even though I've shot everything under the moon, you know, just because I've, you know, taken photos of weddings doesn't mean I'm promoting that, because I don't want to bring that work back. So I feel like what's happened is the commercial clients I've gotten, or the Apples or the Patagonia, it's all come to me because they want that type of work. They want that adventure. They want that storytelling. And that's been, that's kind of been the key situation that I've found myself trying to focus on, is like promoting that type of work that I can bring back in.
In the old sagas and the Viking religion, Aegir, the god of the ocean, had 9 daughters, and they were all super beautiful and had different names, and they were all names of different types of waves. Unner is one of those names.
I think that everybody has to hit rock bottom at some point, you know, and everybody has to spend the time to explore what actually makes them passionate. And I think that passion is, to me, is like, it's the difference between living and existing, right? And I think a lot of us, me included, have just existed, you know? It's the idea of being a photographer and simply being hired because you have a camera and you know how to use it. That's the worst thing ever. Like, you want to be hired because you're bringing creativity, because you're a collaborator, because you're an ideator, because you have some way of seeing the world that's unique from your friend. And I would say that that's what I've always aspired to do, is like have a perspective that's unique.
One night to be confused, one night to speed up truth. We had a promise made.
Ultimately, you know, it's hard to work with your friends. You know this, like, you've worked with, I'm sure, a lot of your friends. Sometimes it's hard to watch your friends suffer and film them in their hard moments. This story of my friend Ellie was something that was told to me in a long car ride through Iceland years ago. And he had told me this story, and I remember just cataloging it in my brain. Like most good stories, I'm like, that could be a cool story to tell. That story could help a lot of people. That story I relate to. And oftentimes as a filmmaker, you're trying to touch on subjects that you feel yourself or you embody yourself, because the best projects, the ones you're really willing to, you know, I guess risk it all for or suffer for, are the ones where you feel personally invested. And in a friend's story, I felt personally invested. And so, but I think one of the cruxes is, like you said, the interview. So typically I have heard this story myself, but I don't want to tell it from my perspective. I don't want to put my, you know, my kind of over dramatization on it. So what I usually do is that once I've gone through the process of asking this friend, Ellie, if we could make a film about him and tell his story, and we structure it all out, the first thing that I do before any of that is I ask him if he would be open to me having somebody interview him, a third party. And so I hired my friend Matt McDonald. He's from Hawaii and just a really talented guy and really talented writer. And so I've worked with him on 2 to 3 films in the past where he has kind of taken my key subject and interviewed them. And then the point of that is, like, I look at, you know, my version of the story and his version of the story, and I make sure that it's congruent. Because the last thing I want to do is jump into this film and be like, well, this is how it was told to me, or this is what I imagined. And then what happens is usually that interview becomes the basis for a voiceover. And so we start to strip stuff out and take stuff and, you know, bring it up to the surface, like the good quotes, we start to kind of work with that text and massage it to make it feel like it's a little bit more tight and a little bit more streamlined. And so that's what you were hearing. You were hearing the interview, but you were hearing it kind of stripped down to maybe more of like a voiceover format. So we did do that in a sound booth, but we wanted it to feel conversational, you know, and that's, I think, how we did that. You know, some of the thoughts don't have an ending. Some of them are kind of open-ended. Some of them are, you know, they just kind of end, and that's what we wanted to feel.
Sometimes it's just hard to know when to share it. But as a parent, you can only dream that your kid carries on what you love most.
Ja, als de min
Ta fram til mömmu. Ekki knús, bye. Það sást ég.
It was a lot of prep time, you know, working on films. I try to pour a lot of energy into like the preparation, like where are we going? What are the shots we need? But you mentioned, and I mean, it shows how detailed of a filmmaker you are because you notice things that most people don't notice, like the feather in the car. That was such an important moment to me because I really have always loved this idea of tokens. Like in a film, there's little tokens that carry you through the film. Even in like Lord of the Rings, you know, there's little things that carry you through. And in the film, we had, you know, Unnur, the daughter, like playing with the feather and then leaving it behind in the car. And that moment of her leaving it behind is kind of like a kind of a example or a bit of foreshadowing. And we're trying to kind of get that pull on those emotional strings. And so the shoot only took us like 10, 11 days in Iceland. We had a pretty like, you know, focused, you know, plan in terms of shooting. But then the editing time took us quite a bit of time because we were sort of like structuring and restructuring and then working on a montage. And luckily we got everything we needed from the one trip, but there was like a pickup shot that we needed to get from Iceland, from Ellie and some other people later, like a couple months later, just like 3-4 seconds. And so I would rather, you know, really be in that editing bay, know exactly the shot we need to get and then pick that up as opposed to like, you know, spending a month just shooting everything, you know, and then you have endless hard drives and whatnot.
Some people think that what I do is cool. But a lot of people, even some of my own family, they think it's a complete waste of time.
Do you still struggle? And if so, with what?
Yeah, I mean, life is full of it. I would say that moving here, you know, I don't want to play a small violin of a sad song, but definitely moving to Iceland and following my passion or my dream was like the single hardest decision I've ever made. I mean, I spent like 15, 18 years building up my, you know, business in California in the States. And I had a beautiful office and I built a gallery and everything and I owned that space and I sold it all. And I made like pennies on the dollar. It wasn't a good time. It wasn't a good financial move, but I did it because it didn't serve me. And I felt like I was so sick of telling people in podcasts or in articles or on social media, like, you know, you got to follow your passion. You got to, you know, live at the edge of your comfort zone, yada, yada, yada. You can only say that stuff for so long until you're like questioning, am I doing that? Like, am I embodying that ethos? And I just felt at a point where I was like, you know what? I'm not. And this is scary. And I'm going to do it because I'm not afraid of taking risks. And I'm not afraid of following my passion. And I know that like, I'm a pretty hardworking person, and if, you know, worse came to worse, I could build that back up again maybe, but ultimately I just felt like that was the call, and it's a scary move. And so yeah, to answer your question, I get scared all the time. I get scared about being a dad. I get scared about, you know, trying to raise good kids in a complicated world, and scared about business and life decisions. And I don't know, I don't live in fear really, but I definitely feel like what work asks of me and what kind of I ask of myself still holds me in a place of feeling nervous at times, but that's how it should be. Like, that's when I know I'm following the right path, is that I'm nervous about, you know, even planning an expedition. Like, if I'm not a little scared, what's the point? if I'm planning a bikepacking trip and I'm not like a little nervous, what's the point, right? It should make you nervous, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, one last question, because
As many as you want, but I love this.
You got guests and you have a dinner coming up. What is the message you don't want your kids to miss from your work or from your life?
My kids, it's fascinating because I've thought a lot about that. And I think a big part of the reason that I moved here was because I wanted my kids to grow up with that same level of independence and freedom that I had growing up. When I grew up in California 38 years ago, it was like, it felt like that, and now it doesn't. And I think that I wanted my kids to realize also that they were the priority, that like, even though I could stay in California, make more money, continue to build this, hypothetical empire, which is so stupid, like, that's not the plan. That's not the goal. That's not what I want. I want to be able to go skiing with them and go riding mountain bikes and, go see an active volcano and give them experiences that I never imagined myself having as a kid, ever.
Just know that out of all my greatest adventures, you boys will always be my favorite. This experience honestly won't be complete until I get to come back here with you. But until then, I'm bringing home lots of photos. As they say up here, north to the future. I love you, Dad.
Sometimes life gives us like permission to do crazy things, and I feel like, again, my real dad didn't make it past 16 years old, so I feel like I'm oftentimes living for both of us, and trying to make up for what he didn't get to experience, and that motivates me and makes me feel empowered when I'm out there.
Wow, What a conclusion, man.
Yeah.
What a beautiful conclusion. Yeah. Well, listen, it's exactly 1 hour.
Yeah.
I promise you 1 hour.
Dude,
I won't take more of your time.
I hope we get to ride bikes together. I hope we get to work on something together. I hope that we get to hang out. It's my dream. I want to come and just pick your brain. And I could have asked you all the same questions and been equally as fascinated. So I'm honored, and I'm stoked to hang and catch up.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And whatever you need, I owe you a big one.
No,
I'm here, whatever you want, man.
I'll see you in Europe. I'll be over there riding for sure.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool. You'll have to ride slow. Come for your recovery ride if you want to ride with me, because I'm a slow ass.
Slow.
I love riding my bike long, but like I'm slow, man.
Slow is fast. You know how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. Have a great evening.
Yeah.
Say sorry to your guests from me.
No worries.
For holding you so long. And thanks again, man. Thanks again.
Appreciate you.
What a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks, man. Ciao. Ciao.
That was rad.